started with our introductions. And why don't we get started with Annie? And if you can share just a little bit more about what you studied in school, what you're up to now, and we'll talk more about the nitty-gritty in the panel.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Cassie, and great to be here with you all today. So my name is Annie Lee. I graduated in 2019 from Weinberg. I majored in neuroscience and minored in, still trying to remember the names, business institutions and French. Currently, I am a senior consultant in change management for a French technology consulting company called Capgemini. And change management, what it basically is, it's when you're implementing a new type of technology, be it artificial intelligence or new enterprise kind of planning and business solutions. You go through a technical transformation, but you also go through a people and workforce transformation. So my job is managing the people side of technological change, and yeah, a little bit about me.
Great, thanks Annie. And Kevin.
Great. Hello, everyone. Hello, especially to those who have their videos on. Thank you very much. No, I'm kidding. Hello to every single one of you. It's nice to virtually meet you all. My name is Kevin Iguburra, and I am a Weinberg class of 2016 graduate. I studied philosophy and economics, preferred the former. My dad maybe do the latter, but I appreciate him for that. So that's my shout out to any economics majors out there. And I am currently a DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion strategist at a small startup called Justice Informed. And in a nutshell, my role is particularly focused around embedding DEI from a structural and strategic lens. So looking at organizations and companies' strategic priorities, strategic levers, but then also looking at their recruitment, their HR policies, and looking at just how to actually make those structured in a way that equity is ensured, or at least the aim of those policies and those initiatives. There's a whole other side of it that's training and more so the theory and the embedding that kind of culture within organizations. I support that, but primarily my work is around the advisory services.
Great, thanks Kevin. And Charlotte.
I'm Charlotte, graduated in 2019, and I studied poli-sci and Asian studies with a minor in BIP. My focus was in Chinese history. And now I work at Bain & Co. I'm an associate consultant, and we do mostly strategy consulting, so helping companies kind of think through their long-term and short-term sometimes plan.
Great, thanks Charlotte. And Daniel.
Hi everyone, I'm Daniel. I'm a 2019 grad out of Weinberg, like most of us here. I studied philosophy like Kevin, and my double major was in neuroscience with Annie. Great to have that connection with other panelists. And right now I am an analyst with Deloitte Consulting. I focus specifically in human capital in our HR transformation space. And so I help companies implement different HR technologies as they undergo these global HR changes. You'd be surprised by how many companies have Excel as their primary HR system. And so we help them to move to the cloud. We help them to have an integrated source or platform through which folks, if they're an education client, maybe that's students, but typically employees want one place to go for all of their HR or employee needs.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Excited to hear more about the ins and outs of your career journeys thus far. And Daniel, we'll start with you with this first question. And I think you guys gave a nice overview of what your work is. If you can dive into a little bit more about like the specifics of what your day-to-day looks like, and just share also more about what were some of the impactful experiences for you on campus, classes, internships, groups, et cetera, that led you to consider this particular career path.
Yeah, more than happy to talk about that. So I know, Charlotte, you mentioned you were doing more strategy focused work. I'm on the implementation side. So once major decisions have been made, it would be teams like mine that go in and sort of make it happen, right? And so my day depends on the phase of the project that we're in. At the beginning of a project, we might be in the discovery and design phases where we're walking our client through all of the different options that they have, helping them to figure out what they actually need out of an HR system. So after all that requirement gathering is done, then we move into a build phase where we actually are in the system, configuring things and working with clients to make sure it's up to speed with what they want. Then we move into a test phase where we move things between environments. So from like a first draft phase into a sort of like final draft or revision stage, and then we go live. Which means to say that we actually allow employees into those new technological environments and they start using those environments full time. When I think about some of the on-campus experiences that have prepared me for consulting, none of them really explicitly did, but I think consulting is a great industry because there are a lot of, I think, tangential or proximal experiences in which you can sort of pull different skills and experiences and apply them to the work that you do as a consultant. I like to think that consulting is this beautiful intersection between both the really granular and quantitative as well as high level abstraction. And I think I got both of those in my majors and in my extracurricular activities. I did a lot of undergrad research, both in philosophy and in and in cardiology. And so one was very, I guess, very scientific and a little bit more granular in nature. And my philosophy research was definitely a lot of high level abstraction with, minimal pragmatic application, unfortunately. But I think both of those exercises helped me to think like a consultant, right? To be able to hold this broad idea of what a company has for its future or goal state, and also be able to work in the intricacies and the nuances and sort of the technicalities of all of the work that needs to get done to move from point A to point B. Happy to dive into that a little bit more, but I do want to make sure other panelists get a chance to speak as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great, Daniel. Thanks for that overview and how each of the majors plays out. That's great. And Charlotte, we'll go to you next. Same question.
Sure. I think on the part of the question around day-to-day, a little more specifics around what we do. Right now I'm doing a rotation in Bain's private equity group. And basically what we do is short due diligences of companies that a client wants to acquire. So it'll be 3 weeks, private equity client wants to buy a soap manufacturer or something. And for the 3 weeks, we'll do a customer survey, make a market model, speak with experts in the soap industry, and help the fund to refine their view on this target and whether it would be a good investment. And I really love that. I've been doing it for the last 8 months. And I think on the part of the question around how our Northwestern experience kind of prepared us or influenced it, I think a little bit like Daniel, my major wasn't super obviously related to consulting, but I always really enjoyed the analytical component of studying poli-sci and history, and I knew that I wanted to do a job with a really big analytical part in it. And then I tried to take accounting and that kind of thing to verify that I didn't hate business. But I think ultimately the biggest thing that translated was at Northwestern in general, you can take such a wide variety of classes, and you can have a couple of majors and you're really not constrained in that sense. And I wanted the same thing out of business. So I the equivalent of the liberal arts of business, which is a phrase that an older alumni said to me one time. And I thought, that's what I want to experience, because I don't really know what I want yet. I love kind of learning about different industries. So that I think was one of the things that helped me pick consulting.
That's great. Thanks, Charlotte. And Kevin.
Yeah, for sure. So my role is it's a little complicated since I work in a startup and there are really just 4 of us. And so in a lot of ways, we wear many hats and we take on a lot of different responsibilities. But strictly on the DEI strategist role, I think the best way I could describe the day-to-day is it kind of depends on your portfolio of clients. Some clients are more so kind of more of the assessments or the audits we're doing. And so that might be running some focus groups of staff members or of management team members or board groups. That may be analyzing survey data and actually just trying to find trends and responses and then compiling that into a report or a presentation. Separately, we might be kind of brainstorming or figuring out how we want to lead a 3-hour facilitation. DEI oftentimes, when you think of it, you think of kind of the organizations in crisis, i.e. those who have just experienced a mass, some type of incident, right? The CEO or the COO or the CHRO has said something incredibly volatile, and now staff are complaining and staff want some type of acknowledgement. There are instances, of course, where there are other microaggressions that are happening or found. And so that might be another type of work that we're doing. We could be helping organizations think through how to, conduct a pay equity analysis. And so we do also provide strategic consulting where we're just advice givers. And we are, in that sense, I think, almost like the truest sense of the word consultant, where we are literally just offering an hour of our time for you to pick our brains about a topic or an issue. And so that's kind of the broad overview of the DEI strategist role, separate from the startup stuff, which is interesting, but not so much consulting. There's some sales, there's some like comms work there. It's all that stuff. And so, yeah, I think I really strongly echo what Daniel and Charlotte were saying. I really loved learning the content in my classes. I think in a lot of ways, one of my regrets is, especially now that social media has killed all of our attention spans, I can't read as quickly and as readily as I used to, and I wish I could absorb the content that I was once able to in classes. That said, I completely agree. I don't think the classes were as instrumental to my ultimate kind of career path and my ultimate career goals. I think for me, it's the student groups and being a part of those, whether it be on the exec groups or committees within, shouts out to Wildcat Welcome or shouts out to Global Engagement Summit, GES. Those are some of the groups I was in. But I think just the ability to move an agenda, right? To move people's time and resources to create things, whether it be a presentation or a summit or get things going. I think those skills are crucial to any type of consulting endeavor you're going to be doing. And I think that was what I found most analogous to my current work.
Great, that's really helpful. Thanks, Kevin, for talking through the ins and outs of your work and all the different hats you wear. And Annie, same question for you.
Yeah, so you're going to be hearing a lot of echoing because very similar to the rest of our panelists today, very nonlinear path between my academics and my work now. In terms of my day-to-day, I am always in meetings 24/7, leading this meeting, giving some presentation, sitting in this meeting, meetings all day long. So screen fatigue is real. I'm not wearing my blue light glasses right now, but they're right next to me. For me, a lot of my work kind of bridges between some of the strategy work that Charlotte does and the implementation that Daniel does. So we, in our group of change management, will kind of go end to end, right from the beginning. And even Kevin, you were mentioning sales, we also sell the work. We don't have a sales arm. So we start the relationship building with our clients really early on and get them invested in what it means to do a transformation for people, and having them understand that, you can't really just shove something in users' face or employees' faces in terms of the system that is the core of what they do every day. A good example is right now my client is a chemicals company, specialty chemicals, and a lot of their work is shop floor, inside plant. Literally when we were doing kind of our early design and kind of what's it going to look like, current state versus what we want the future to be, they were like, we use pen and paper to do our analyses. And we were like, oh, yikes, because we're trying to implement a lot of automation and some artificial intelligence. So it's a big gap for a workforce to go from that kind of point A to point B. So what I do kind of touches a lot of different elements of analysis. So we'll do a change impact assessment where we are all in Excel and heat mapping and conditional formatting and numbers and kind of taking qualitative data and turning it into quantitative data so that we can build plans and kind of strategize from there about what the experience is going to look like. Communications and marketing is something that I've been doing for the past 11 months on this project. I've been leading that effort. So everything about communicating changes, design, kind of visual brand for the company and the project. What else there? And then getting ready for when you do press the go button and it turns live, how do you get the workforce ready for those types of things? So that's been my role lately. A huge part of change management is training. So you have this whole new solution, but you got to go through some training, lead that, build those materials for a new tech system. So what's been nice is my previous role about a year ago was really training focused. And I kind of felt like I was wearing technical hats and people hats because I had to learn the system in order to write training and, you know, deliver training to someone else. So it was kind of nice to bridge that gap. And yeah, a lot of metrics, a lot of communicating, a lot of just kind of being thrown into open waters and just being like, okay, time to swim, you know, like that type of thing. So yeah, I really enjoy my current work. I really enjoy consulting. Obviously, neuroscience, business, French does not line up linearly to consulting. I was actually very anti-consulting. Daniel knows this, and Cassie, I think you know this too. But I was very anti-consulting coming out of college because I thought, oh, you know, it's like the econ bro world. Like I don't really fit into that, you know. But the opportunity just kind of landed in my lap accidentally. And really, I'd say so many things from Northwestern helped me in consulting. Time management, I think, is one of the biggest ones. During undergrad, you know, you have classes, you have extracurriculars, which for me was Refresh Dance Crew. So rehearsing all the time, dancing, all that kind of stuff. I had a part-time job during all of college. So balancing a lot of things in one time span, one day. That's exactly what I still have to do today. When I was in college, I used to plan my day pretty intensely and just think to myself, you know, if I can execute a plan and do the best I can do, the day, you know, job's a good one, the day is going well. And I feel like that's still how I work today, like planning out in my calendar the things that I need to do and just doing my best to get through them. So time management is big. The only internship I did was when I was abroad in France. I was an operational marketing intern for a medical devices company in France. And that really helped me for my work now because my company is really global. I think we're like 300,000 people in like 90 some countries. So it's like a lot of cultural differences come into play in a lot of our work. And being able to work in a French company before, you know, this opportunity fell in my lap and continuing to work for a French company, to get to see that beforehand was really, really helpful. And that was part of my study abroad program. So to kind of be matched with an internship and put into the workforce. So that for me was critical. And yeah, I totally agree with Kevin, like being a part of student groups at Northwestern, mobilizing people, whether it's for dance, whether it's for summits, like Kevin was talking about, mobilizing people and being able to create change, create excitement and engagement with people. I think that's something that plays into my work a lot. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for the answers to that first question. And I know some of you are in your first role after college. So this next question is more about landing the first role and how you strategize from there. And so if you're in your first role, was this your plan A? You know, even if it is, if you want to talk about your first role for some of you who have moved on, just sharing if that was like exactly what you wanted to do after graduation and how you went about strategizing your next step from there. You know, because our students are thinking, you know, I need to land the perfect job, or, you know, I want to make sure this puts me on the right trajectory. So let's just dive into that a little bit. And maybe Daniel, we'll start with you again.
Yeah, so my first job was teaching English. I was a Fulbright scholar in Malaysia, And so I was teaching English to a school of about 800 students. I had 400 in my classrooms, and it was not quite related to consulting either, but certainly something that I had wanted to do. I think all of us to have gotten to Northwestern likely have a deep appreciation for some of the teachers who've been pivotal in getting us to this school. And I thought this was a really cool way to have that sort of educational experience in a really structured way before moving on sort of with the rest of my career. So it was something that I had planned on doing and was something that I had actively worked for in my senior year leading up to graduation. And what I will say is, even though teaching is not explicitly related to consulting, I think that there are a lot of, to Annie's point, time management skills that I developed as a teacher, a lot of like client engagement skills that I developed as a teacher. For me, I've had no harder experience than trying to get a classroom full of children who do not speak English to engage with me when I do not speak Malay or Chinese or any of the other languages that my students were speaking. And the other thing that I will say too is there are so many extracurricular activities and organizing that sort of felt like mini consulting projects, getting buy-in from teachers, thinking about sort of like a design requirement for an extracurricular activity or engagement, building it out and then actually executing it. So certainly overlap, although a little bit more, I think, maybe anecdotal or metaphorical in nature rather than like an explicit sort of training for consulting.
That's great, Daniel. And I think Charlotte, you're up next.
Yeah, I came straight to Bain out of undergrad. So a pretty direct path. I will say though, I started recruiting for consulting during junior year. And I went through, there's like a very formal recruitment cycle where like the companies all come to campus and there's like the applications on Handshake. And I like didn't get any single offer in junior fall, which at the time felt like pretty bad. And I was like, oh no, what do I do now? And it was fine, there's still recruitment off cycle, like after fall, kind of in winter and spring. So I did that recruitment until I found an internship. But I think in terms of like, it's okay if it like doesn't work out perfectly the first time. Like if you know where you want to go or if you don't, if you kind of make sure you do something and you keep pushing it, it'll sort of fall into place a little better.
Yeah, I think that's such a great message. Charlotte, thank you for sharing that, because it is so stressful when you're in the moment and you're like, this is it. And to hear from, alumni who went through these experiences and are able to go off cycle, I think that's just so valuable for our students. So thanks for sharing that. And Kevin, would love to hear your perspective on this too.
Yeah, I also taught right after college. I through a fellowship, I went to Botswana in Southern Africa, and I taught history, and that was an incredible experience. And like to this day, I still tell people like the best year of my life, because it is. I will have a better year, but to this point, it's the best one I've had, and so I don't regret it at all. And I think that would probably be my advice is like life is so long and so are your 20s actually. Let me tell you, as a soon to be 27-year-old, I'm actually kind of maybe a little bit looking forward to my 30s. Explore a bit and like just try some things out and look forward to just different, like experimenting in different things. And so for me, yeah, like it was a 1-year fellowship. I knew I'd always been interested in teaching, so I did have like a strategy in the sense of I'm gonna figure out if this is what I would want to do long term. But I was more so looking for the experience, and for me personally, having family not from Botswana but from the continent, it was also a cool experience for me to reconnect in that way too. And so I would just say like, consider that in your job search. And then to connect it back to consulting, I went from that role in Botswana to to a consulting role at a small nonprofit in Chicago, though not the startup I'm in now, a different one. And so I think that my transition point, I don't know if it was Annie that mentioned this earlier, but someone had mentioned how like consulting oftentimes is it's an enticing opportunity or field because it really does connect you to so many different opportunities with just this kind of like one-stop shop in a lot of ways, regardless of where you go. You're developing skills that are very tangible and very decipherable across industries. And so I think I had a very similar mindset coming out of teaching, where I loved teaching, but I also wanted a bit more of a broader view of the world and of systemic issues, and wanted some of those skills, those transferable skills. Teaching 100% goes into consulting, to Daniel's point, super easy. We could talk about that at a different session, but yeah, I'll leave it at that. But that was sort of my first, I loved it. And I also loved that it got me to kind of consulting, which is where I'm at now.
That's great. Thanks, Kevin. And Annie.
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned to you guys, I was not searching for consulting at all. I was looking to go more into the medical industry and health and medical devices and that type of thing. So yeah, it wasn't really my strategy at all. Like I remember senior year, I had this whole spreadsheet like that I was taking to my career fairs, and I was like, this is who I'm going to talk to, and like this is what I'm going to say. It's going to be great. I ran into Capgemini, my current company, while I was in line for a different company at a career fair at Northwestern, because those lines are long. And I just hit it off with the girl who was manning the booth for the company, and we connected because I think it was ballet actually that we connected on. We both danced ballet. And so nothing work related at all. And then she told me she was with the company and what they did. And I was like, oh, I have no technical skills. Like I took one comp sci class, like the intro one, the easiest one. I was like, I don't know anything about consulting, but yes, I'll come to your info session. Yes, we can hang out later. And really just everyone I met along the way was so great. And that's how I ended up here. Once I got to Capgemini, they basically trained a cohort of 90 of us at the same time who were entering together. And they do this big reveal where they don't tell you prior what department you're going to sit in or what you're going to specialize in. And so they had us all together and they had like a little flip chart thing. And then they would say the names who are going into that department. They do the flip chart. Mine says like change management. They call my name and I'm like, great. What the heck is that? You know, like I have never heard of any of these things that this company does. So I very much kind of just jumped in feet first and went with it. And it's been absolutely the best first experience. That would be kind of my main message, that I don't think there is like a perfect dream first job. If I had to imagine myself in this role 3 years ago or so, as I was preparing to kind of take the next step after undergrad, there is no way I would have seen this coming. And for me, you know, neuroscience, business, French, you can kind of tell that I did not know one destined path for me, you know? So yeah, that's one thing that I would just kind of pass along as a word of wisdom is don't narrow yourself and your mindset based on what you think is going to be your dream job or what you think is going to give you the most fulfilling and amazing experience, because every job, no matter what, has its ups and downs. Even though some jobs market themselves as being more, you know, like creative and work-life balance, and some other jobs seem more routine and things like that. Every job has elements of the good and bad. Every job has fluctuations in how you feel about your work. So I would just try to frame it in that sense. There's not always one dream job, one linear set path. I think for all of us as panelists, it's been, you know, non-linear. So getting from Northwestern to where we are today. So yeah, that's what I'd say on that one.
Yeah, I love that. And Annie, something you mentioned about the different majors that you had kind of guides us into this next question about interviews and how you talk about your background being an asset to your job. And so I'm curious, you know, one, if your majors come up in interview questions for these jobs that you've gotten, and also if if and how you talk about that arts and science background. And can you give us like an example in the interview, like how that ties into the job that you were going for? And Annie, we'll start with you.
Oh, sure. So yeah, oftentimes recruiters would see my resume and they'd see those three things, neuroscience, business, French, and they'd be like, girl, what are you doing? You know, like, why did you pick those? So for me, yeah, I would kind of talk about them differently based on what I was interviewing for, but I always connected it back to people, which for me was my motivator ever since I was really, really young, always about understanding people. So I talk about how that drove me to specialize in cognitive and behavioral neuroscience, obviously people from a biological base standpoint, how our minds work and what makes us behave and act in the way we do. And then business from kind of about people's application in the broader workforce and in the world. How does the world spin from more of a business economic standpoint? How do they make decisions that influence so much of our behavior as consumers of information, product, all sorts of things? And then French about culture and immersion and how culture is such a huge factor in us as people and how that can influence a lot of ways that people work, they think, all those types of things. So I tried to find one element that kind of strung through all of those three things that I studied and really push that forward, because everything I was going for was still related to business and people in some sort. And I think really people and behavior are at the heart of so many jobs. So yeah, that was kind of my one way to string it all through. I just focused on the people, and then I would walk my interviewers through how people kind of was a theme in everything I studied and how I see it being a theme in what my work is. So yeah.
That's great, Annie. Thanks for that. I love the tie-in to the three seemingly different majors. And Kevin, curious how you talk about it in your interviews or if it's come up.
Yeah, you know, I'll say that economics, you know, doesn't come up often. I think it's a fairly common major that they see, and they're like, another one of these. And so that might be an instance in which I benefit from like a level of camouflage. Philosophy, I don't know if it's explicitly come up, though I have always found that it has been very helpful for me in the kind of post-grad era, more so in the sense of just in the ability it's given to, like, I think, one, hold opposing ideas and conflicting ideas and hold them both as true and valid at the same time. And I would say if an interviewer were to ask me kind of like, what does a philosophy major teach you? I would actually point to a very specific thing a professor once said, and I forget which professor it is. But God bless him. I remember he said to our class, he said, when I'm grading your papers, your philosophy papers, if for you to get an A, I need to see that you are actually arguing against the strongest version of the other person's argument, not a straw man, not a poorly articulated version of it, or not your interpretation, and not necessarily even what that person said, but what is their most. But even if you identify the flaws, all right, if you can rectify those flaws and make a better argument, can you knock that one down? And he was saying that is really the test of a true, like, you know, a strong philosopher and how to get a good paper or a good grade. And that always stuck with me, and that's always the spirit I take in conversation. And it's in a client setting and in a consulting setting, I think that's gold. I think you want to be able to kind of create that sense of building off of one another and creating a shared strong argument, project, goal, vision, whatever you want to call it. And so I would equate my philosophy major to that. But I actually don't think I've been asked that question. But there you go. That's what I would say.
I love it. I love it. Thanks, Kevin, for sharing. And that's interesting. That's great that you have an answer, even though you've never been asked that in an interview. I think that's great. And Charlotte, curious if it's come up in your interviews or how you talk about it with, you know, some different majors as well.
Sure. I think in consulting, the two questions you might get around your non-conventional major would be, why did you do it? And why is it useful? As two kind of distinct questions. And for me, why did you do it is always the easier one, because I loved poli-sci and Asian studies, and that was what I was interested in learning more about and studying. And then kind of as a side note, I'm also interested and passionate about business and consulting. And, I think there's like room for both in my life, but that's kind of what I wanted to do next. On the why is it useful side, I think with majors that are, more like non-quantitative, there's a couple of threads, like Annie mentioned, like communication is a big one, and like the people. And I think another really big thread is like the analytical nature. So, if you are like a history major or a poli-sci major, being able to really convincingly articulate an argument, no matter what it is, based on proof that you believe and you want other people to believe, is something that sort of applies probably wherever you go, and especially in business. But it's kind of a different kind of, it's like the same lens, but looking at a different problem with different tools almost. So that was usually the thread I would give, is like, look, I think this really built up my problem solving skills, and I can write a really good argument about something. And like last time I checked, you need to write arguments as well in business, even if they're in slides. So I think that's my general, how would you answer it overview.
Yeah, I love that. That's great, Charlotte. Thanks for breaking that down in a different way. That's great. And Daniel, curious your perspective if it's come up in interviews.
Yeah, so I definitely talked about it during my interviews because people were mostly just really confused. And I think there's two parts I want to talk about: what I said in interviews and how, like, now that the interviews are done and I've been working, what it's actually been like, and if I actually use my arts and science background. Because I was interviewing for human capital very specifically, as opposed to strategy or like tech, for example, I boiled my majors down into what they were, and I boiled human capital consulting into what it was, right? So human capital consulting thinks about the human component of work. And the big question that you're trying to answer is, why are people doing the things that they're doing in the context of work? And so I talked about my philosophy major as an education in understanding human nature and in understanding why people are motivated to do the things they do from a very high level, from like a life fulfillment level. Like when we think about self-actualization, why do people pursue it in different ways, and what drives them to make the decisions that they do? From the neuroscience perspective, I was studying human behavior as well, but from, how electric currents and neurotransmitters might influence decisions or thoughts and change human behavior. And so, is it a stretch to say that those two things are exactly related to consulting? Absolutely. But for the purposes of an interview, I think what I was showing and being able to talk about my majors as being deeply connected to the type of work that I would be asked to do, is I was showing them that I could build an argument, walk someone through it, and arrive at a logical response, at a logical conclusion, even if that argument was a little bit tenable. In terms of how I actually bring my art and science background to my work today, I obviously am not really talking about philosophy or neuroscience in my work now, as sort of in sitting between human capital and technology. But what I will say is that both majors, in sort of what I was talking about at the beginning, taught me how to think, right? So think from both a very analytical and structured way, as Charlotte was saying, but also in a way that sort of kept a big idea, and then also in a way that I could understand and hold, to Kevin's point, conflicting perspectives or conflicting thoughts, right? Whenever you're working for a client, you're going to have multiple stakeholders, even though it's one client, and oftentimes they will disagree. On my current client right now, I have a design team and a content team who do not like each other, and often have 100% conflicting ideas. And so it is my job to help bridge that gap and to help find some sort of resolution and solution that satisfies both parties, obviously requiring compromise on both sides. But I really think that's what both of those majors taught me, like how to find those compromises in having studied things that seem a little bit different and seem like they're coming to answer questions about human behavior from fundamentally different points of view.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It is interesting when it comes up, and sometimes it doesn't, and having those answers ready, I think, can be so valuable in different settings. So thanks for sharing more about those interviews. And I'd love to dive into some student questions. And so students, of course, as we get started taking your questions, feel free to send those into the private chat if you want me to ask them, or you can send them into the public chat and I'll call on you to ask your question of our panelists. So we'll get started. I have a question here from Dina. She's asking, what is your day-to-day routine pre-COVID and during COVID? And I'll even just add, what do you think is on the horizon? Because I think that is another curious question as well. So Daniel, why don't we start with you and we'll weave our way through the panelists again.
So I have been totally virtual. I was teaching in person, and then when COVID hit, I came back to the States. And so my entire Deloitte experience has been virtual. So I will leave it to our other panelists to speak more about the lifestyle from a pre-COVID perspective. But from a during COVID perspective, oftentimes my day starts with, unfortunately, this client tends to be on camera. My previous client did not. So I was often in my bed taking a call in the morning when I was on my previous client. Now I do dress up. They're a fashion company, so there are high standards. But they are in the athleisure space, the athletic space. So oftentimes it is relatively, it's comfortable, but I put in effort. Typically, often, like Annie said, there's quite a few meetings, but I try to block off and punctuate my time with working sessions with either people in my team or with other developers. I work with a team in India as well. And so oftentimes my mornings are spent checking in with them, seeing the work that they did, and preparing for the rest of the day, the rest of the build. Typically by the evening, I do a check-in at some point in the middle of the day and by the end of the day with my manager, just to make sure I'm tracking. And then I will coordinate with my India team for their day of work while we're getting some rest on the US side. In terms of tracking, I have no idea for what comes in the future. My guess is that there'll be some sort of hybrid, hopefully a little bit more flexible, a little bit more of a sustainable pace for consultants, because it can kind of be a fast-paced industry. But again, as someone who hasn't actually done the real in-person job, I'm going to defer to everyone else to answer that question a little bit more.
That's great. Thanks, Daniel. That's really helpful hearing more about the ins and outs. And Charlotte, would love your perspective at Bain.
Sure. I was a consultant pre-COVID, and my first case was out in the burbs. That's where the client was. So you'd like wake up at like a Monday, you'd wake up at like, I don't know, 6 or something. You'd get in an Uber, and you'd be at the client site by 8:30 with like a little carry-on suitcase because you're staying in a hotel for the next 4 days. And we would spend the whole, like maybe until 6 or 7 at the client site, either in workshops or internal meetings, doing whatever slides or analysis needed to be done. And then at 7, we would like get there as a team usually. Then like 8 or 9 back to the hotel room or the hotel lounge, and then like work a little bit more. And then you'd kind of do that for a few days in a row, and then Thursday afternoon at 5 or 6, you'd like come back to your house, and Fridays we'd go into the office. And I think similar to a lot of people in COVID, fully virtual. But I think as of September 1st, we're going to be back in office fully, though now I think everyone is allowed to go back into the office, but not required. But Bain is a pretty, like, culturally, they really care about like being really close and kind of spending a lot of time together, and the team side of that. So I don't know if there will necessarily be a very hybrid model kind of in the post-COVID world, though hopefully there is flexibility for those who need it.
That's great. That's really interesting hearing a little bit more about the organizational culture too, as you approach, post-pandemic working relationships. That's really interesting. Thanks, Charlotte. And Kevin, curious from your perspective.
Yeah, so pre-COVID, I was in a different role at a different organization. So hard to do it before and after. So the role I had before this one was I was an associate / analyst at a smaller nonprofit that provided consulting services for Chicago, generally Chicago or Chicagoland nonprofits and the government. And so I think, very similarly to what Charlotte said, like I would wake up. The one difference is that everything was local, so there was no travel. So I generally had a morning commute to the office, an evening commute back, which I will actually say I miss terribly. I really miss my commute to work. But then, you spend the day in meetings, doing work for your client. Occasionally there'd be, someone would throw out, let's go to happy hour, let's grab a meal, or you just go home, whatever. And you just, go on about your day. Obviously, COVID has made everything virtual. And sorry, given that there's something going on outside, given that we're only 4 people in my current organization. We're a pretty small startup. We have a co-working space available to us, but I don't think that we're going to mandate that we be there during like working hours. So I believe that we will remain in some hybrid, mostly virtual setting until we get like large enough that there's more people that warrant like an office space.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really interesting how your organization is small enough to where you say it makes more sense for us to not buy an office space. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's just if we need to meet, like, let's just go to a coffee shop, especially now that things are reopening. Let's go to a coffee shop. Let's just meet up somewhere else and crank out this work.
Yeah, that's great. That's definitely an interesting perspective and really great for students to consider looking at the different organizations they may want to be working at. Building out a organizational culture or moving into something that has something more established. So
exactly.
Absolutely. And Annie, curious your perspective, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic.
Yeah, so I, like Charlotte, started consulting pre-pandemic. My first role really, I think I was still in this role when the pandemic hit. I was traveling to Portland, Oregon for my project. We were only going 1 week out of each month though, which was perfect for me. I had actually voiced that I wanted to travel 50% or less because I wanted to be in Chicago, and my partner and I, we had done long distance for college, and then he moved here when we started working, so I didn't want to be doing long distance after college as well. So that was really important to me, like personal life balance. Just like Charlotte was saying, like get up early in the morning, you fly. I felt, I really liked that life. I like flying. I would take the red eyes home on Thursdays and come in literally at like 5 a.m. on Friday. And then I would like pass out, and then I would go into the office mostly to hang out with friends on Fridays and, do some of the more internal work, or like Kevin was saying, happy hours and game nights and things like that. So that was my pre-COVID reality. When I wasn't traveling, I'd go into the office maybe 1 or 2 days a week, and I would be working from home the rest of the time. So not too much of a change when we switched to all virtual. I was still used to taking calls in my sweatpants. Nothing changed there. So, but now looking to the future, I think we're kind of moving towards hybrid, similar to what Charlotte was saying, very team-oriented energy, but more so team for the client. So it's all about like, we want to get you to the client ASAP. It's all about those relationships. Our client has even been like begging for us to come, but we are not considering it at this time. So yeah, pretty much I think people will be going back to client site eventually. But in terms of the office space, like for our actual company, very much optional. So I think starting in July, end of July, they'll be welcoming people. If you would like to come, or if it's more convenient for your working situation, feel free to come in 1 or 2 days a week. I think it'll be good to kind of move to that hybrid model, but I don't know that it will ever be 100% travel for us ever again. I think a lot more companies have seen that even if you're starting a whole new like 2-year-long implementation virtually, it's doable. We've done it. That's my current project, and many others have seen that sort of, life cycle virtually. And I think even if we do start to travel to client site, it's still only going to be 50% or so, because people are realizing you don't necessarily need it all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting now that we're forced to be online, how much we can get done in that space. Definitely eye-opening, I think, for many industries. And our next question from Trent, he's asking, he says, you all briefly touched on this, but what does the work-life balance and culture of each of your organizations look like? And if maybe we can go through Annie, work our way backwards. Would love to hear everybody's perspective at your organization.
Sure. So I feel blessed to have great work-life balance at my company. I think a lot of it comes from the French culture of our company. They don't want us to be working that long, honestly, and a lot of our leadership and management very much embodies that. So I typically work 7 to 4. And after 4-ish, the girl's good to go. You know, like there are some days when I have to obviously put in more time for certain things, or as we're getting ready to deploy something, obviously it becomes a big deal. So you do put in the time. But other than that, I'm done at 4. So perfect timing for this panel today, because I closed my last meeting and then headed over to you guys. So work-life balance for me is good. A really important part of what I find fulfilling and what kind of helps balance things out when I'm in work, not just having it always be client-based, work-based, is getting involved in some of the kind of resource groups or clubs that my company has. Like I said, really big company. So a lot of our groups for, you know, women and gender parity advancement, or specific cultural minorities and LGBTQ+, veterans, all those types of groups have a really thriving community. So being a leader in that space has been really great and helps work not always feel like the same client-based work. You kind of, same with extracurriculars and school, you kind of get to mix some of your passions in there as well. So grateful that my company allows me to do that, and definitely grateful for the work-life balance, because as much as I love being busy, I love relaxing even more. So yeah, that's it for me.
Yeah, that's such a great perspective, Annie, and I appreciate you bringing up aspects of the company and what you do in your work that adds to the balance that you get while you're at work. I think that's a really great perspective that we don't always hear when thinking about that work-life balance question. So, and Kevin, we'll go to you next, and I'm sure, you know, curious with the startup culture, how that has impacted the culture.
Yeah, definitely. Also, my neighbor is playing some music, so if you hear it, that's what the background orchestra is. But yeah, our CEO has a DEI organization that's really focused on being inclusive and welcoming for all people. I think he has a very laissez-faire attitude, in the sense of, you know, if you get your work done, I don't necessarily need to see you working at all hours of the day. So that translates to us having, short of course, scheduled meetings. And we generally try to keep to a 9 to 5 cadence, because the rest of the working world is at that pace and we are client facing. But short of like meeting times or whatever, your time is your own, which has been really fun and awesome from a work-life balance standpoint, and up until, and this is more of a personal problem, a procrastination gets the better of me, and I'm like, oh crap, that project that I was given 2 weeks to do, I now have 2 days to do, right? And so that's very much a me thing. And I definitely would kind of prefer this to, you know, even in my prior role at my nonprofit, my work-life balance, with the exception of one project, was fine. But even there, I think that there was just a heightened sense of anxiety that was around just like needing to kind of prove that you are working and prove that you are producing something, that I appreciate not having at the startup that I have now. So yeah, so I'll say that I am blessed in that regard.
That's great, Kevin. I definitely have heard, you know, stereotype on the other end of the spectrum with a startup. So I think that's really nice that you don't feel that pressure, and that culture is true to what they're trying to build. That's great. And Charlotte, curious, I know you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but if you have anything else you want to share about Bain.
Yeah, I think like for me, sustainability is about finding the work fulfilling. And so I think I've had a really sustainable experience, especially in the latter half of my time at Bain, even though the hours themselves haven't changed. I think there's like basics, right? Like being able to like work out and like sleep a normal amount, which if you don't have that, it's like really hard to find work-life balance. But, you know, despite the fact that it's like 60 hours, like Monday to Friday, which is like definitely at first a shock. Um, I've seen like two very, very different sort of sides of, I guess, like how I feel in a project that I didn't like versus in a project that I love where I'm very close to my team members. So I think it's really about just finding that fit and what works for you.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. Like the hours may seem long, but if you're enjoying the work and you're finding it meaningful, you're putting a lot into those hours and getting a lot out of it, which is great. And Daniel, we'll close it out with you.
Yeah, so with implementation work, you have different phases of the project. And so my hours sort of oscillate with my project. So certainly during the beginning parts of a project where we're in meetings all the time with our client as we're capturing requirements, I tend to work a little bit more. And certainly in the testing and leading up to the go live, so the launch of the product tends to be quite chaotic. Very much like the quarter system, you can think of it like midterms and finals. But in that immediate, right after go live, my client just went live over the weekend. I mean, today I've had maybe 35 minutes of work to do. So it's been really, really lovely. But I will say that the culture of Deloitte and especially of my practice is, I will be asked to give 100% sometimes. Again, like in design and build, and especially so leading up to go live. But when Deloitte is asking for 15% and I can round down to 10%, I will give them 10%. And so, for example, again, like this week, I'm giving them 3%, really. Like whatever the bare minimum is to get done, that is how long I will be online. I keep my phone close by so that if there's an emergency or something comes up, I can respond quickly. But there is no obligation for me to just like hover at my computer and like jiggle my mouse every 5 minutes to pretend to be online. So that's something I really appreciate, and I think goes to some of the other points brought up about sustainability, right? That like I can handle giving 100% as long as I get those like 10% breaks as well. I think more broadly, I think to Annie's point, a lot of the different companies that you'll be looking at have significant identity groups, and those are great spaces for folks to get involved and meet people who have shared experiences. But I think one thing that I really loved about Deloitte, and I know is not necessarily unique to my company, but I've really benefited from, is a culture of mentorship. Because as someone who was not necessarily prepared for this industry, I relied on the expertise and the experience of people older than myself to navigate through different challenges, both in my client work and in navigating sort of the networking professional component that I'd never really given thought to as either a neuroscience major or a philosophy major.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing the ins, a little bit more about your organization specifically, and of course about your career paths. I know we're over time. I want to thank our alumni again for sharing so many great insights and advice and stories and experiences. It's been great spending this last hour with you all. And for our students on the line, we typically buy you all lunch or dinner at these events. So we're going to be sending you a Grubhub gift card instead, since we can't see you in person right now. And we're also going to have another event on Friday. I'll shoot you guys an email tomorrow. It's called the Anti-Networking event, just another fun way to chat with alumni in small groups. So keep an eye out for that. But thank you again to our alumni for being here. This has been great. We hope you have a great rest of your day, and go Cats.
Go Cats.